I'm David Pietraszewski,
And I'm David Pinsof.
and today, what is the name of this podcast, David?
Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast.
That makes sense. That checks out if you look at the logo, and yeah, okay, good.
All right.
And is that? Oh, no, no, I'm supposed to say
The tagline,
actual, yeah, actual, actual evolutionary psychology by
actual
actual
evolutionary
evolutionary
psychologists.
psychologists. All right, hey, we did that in tandem. That was great. David, I was gonna say. It sounded like I had something and I didn't. David, what are we doing today?
We are talking to a really awesome guest by the name of Pat Barclay, who
Pat is
is a,
fantastic and I
yeah,
think a super underrated. I think if you did the ratio of how important their work is and sort of to what extent do other people who are sort of not doing the work but sort of foisting it onto us as their own, I would say, this is a case of Pat just being the actual sort of person running the
yes.
show.
Pat is one of those people who I wish would be the poster child for what evolutionary psychology is. When people ask me for like good
Oh yeah,
evolutionary psychology, Pat is one of the
totally.
people I point people to,
Yes.
just because he's doing such great work. And he does work on one of the most interesting and important topics, which is cooperation, altruism, how we choose our social partners, how we judge our social partners based on their moral character. This is just fascinating stuff. He has really insightful ways of thinking about it. I think you're really going to like this conversation. We had a blast having it, and I'm sure you'll have a blast listening to it.
Yeah, and just he's a gentleman and a scholar, a wonderful
Yes,
man, and we're really lucky to have him in
yes.
evolutionary social sciences. And without further ado, here is Pat Barclay, and David and I. Today we have Pat Barclay, University of Guelph, which is Southern Ontario. Is that right, Pat?
Yeah,
Yeah, I grew up
Guelph's about an
outside.
hour west of Toronto.
Oh, great. Yeah. Yeah, Southern Ontario is lovely, especially when it's not dark and snowy. But I grew up outside of
I would say
Buffalo.
it's more lovely when it's dark and snowy.
Oh, that's true.
Because snow is beautiful when you get used to wearing the layers, and it's a great time of year.
There's no bad weather, just bad clothing. This is something the
Exactly.
Germans said all the time, and the kids were out all year round. And I can attest that actually they're generally right. Although anyway, so Pat, really great to have you on. And I'm just going to go through a few things that you study. So one
Hmm.
is biological markets, partner
Hmm.
choice, and competitive helping.
Hmm.
Reputational benefits for cooperative behavior, costly punishment,
Hmm.
scales of competition,
Hmm.
cognitive mechanisms underlying cooperative exchange, intergroup competition, and group threats. Um, I like this category, miscellaneous cooperation. You'll have to explain that. Miscellaneous.
Everything that doesn't fit under
Oh,
one of
I
the titles
see.
above.
Yeah, and exactly. So whenever we have somebody on, I sort of like to think about, and maybe people don't like this, but I don't know. People can let us know. But I like to think about sort of what I think about them. And I think for me, I've been listening to you give talks about cooperation for years. And my impression is, and you can tell me if this is accurate or not, is that for me at least, growing up in the early 2000s of the evolutionary biology of cooperation, that was the really hot topic. And even though people knew that organisms and especially people are hyper cooperative, there was a mystery as to how do you solve the inherent fragility of cooperation. So there's this free rider problem, and we've talked about that on past episodes. David has sort of elaborated on what that means. And I think from my perspective, you have just sort of been doing a yeoman's work of just chugging along and steadily solving the problems of cooperation with colleagues like Nikolai Rahani, and we should have her on too, although she's in New Zealand, which is going to be a tricky
Tough for the time
time
difference. Yeah.
difference. Yeah, but so number one, do you accept that that sort of would be the North Star sort of your research? And you don't have to be. I mean, I will say this for you. Like I genuinely think that you are probably the person I can think of most that has sort of solved this problem of what are the mechanisms, both from an ultimate and also proximate perspective, in terms of sort of like how do you solve the problems inherent in cooperation.
Ultimate meaning, the Darwinian function, and proximate
Yes.
meaning
Yeah,
What are the
these.
selective pressures that result in a psychology that makes us want to ever cooperate with others?
exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah, good
Right.
good point. Yeah, we actually haven't. We should just talk about that jargon exactly. And just a good example would be something like if you say, well, why do parents love their children? And you say oxytocin is a hormone that makes parents love their children.
Right. But then
That
why do parents have oxytocin, and
exactly,
why does it, fire in these certain situations? It,
exactly.
and I think the cooperation literature is one of these cases where
Mm,
we really need to distinguish between these different kinds of questions. People will say, like, you see Johnny helping Sally, and you say, well, why is Johnny helping Sally? And one person will say, oh, it's because Johnny feels good about helping Sally. And somebody else will say,
Yeah.
oh, well, it's because Johnny learned to help others. And somebody else will say, oh, it's because Johnny is engaging in reciprocity. He helps Sally and makes Sally more likely to help him in return. And people pit these against each other as if they're competing explanations. Whereas really, like, all three of them could be right, or all three of them could be wrong, right? Johnny feels good about helping Sally. Why does he feel good? Well, because he learned to do so. Well, why did he learn that? Well, because when he helped people in the past, they helped him in return. And so he learned, right? But though that last question would be the kind of question that I tend to focus on, the ultimate function. What are the selective pressures that result in that, helping psychology being in the head in the first place?
Mhm.
So really, interestingly, that the ultimate proximate confusion or explanation, what you're saying is it lies at the heart of what had been, and I think it's getting better, and you can tell me if you agree with this, a pretty confused and confusing literature.
Yeah, I think this mix up between what's going on in the head and how did it get there. I mean, I think that's been a confusion in a lot of literatures.
Mhm.
I think it's a point that we need to start driving in right from first year psychology. But it definitely comes up in a lot of the evolutionary psychological discussions where people mistake what evolutionary psychologists are saying and will
Mhm.
think that an evolutionary psychologist is talking about what is going on in the head, whereas really they might be talking about the selection pressures that got that stuff in the head there. And yeah, the cooperation literature has been particularly prone to this, to this proximate and ultimate confusion, or at
Mhm.
least it has been from my vantage point, maybe because I'm more familiar with it. But perhaps it has come up just as much in other areas as well.
Hmm. Do
Right.
you think it's because we care so deeply about what's going on in the head in terms of our personal and social lives? We want to know how generous and kind other people are. We want to know their moral character. We scrutinize each other's actions and behaviors and utterances to try to gain insights into what kind of person they are. And we care deeply about our own reputation and broadcasting to others that we have a good moral character and that the stuff in our head is noble and praiseworthy. And so, might it be that because we're so obsessed with what's going on in the head, that this creates this confusion between proximate and ultimate levels? That as soon as you start talking about how the stuff in the head got there, we instantly, jump to this place that we're all too familiar with, which is judging other people and in showing off our moral character. Do you buy that might be?
That's a really interesting idea. I'd never
Yeah.
thought about it that way. I always had thought about it just more in terms of some people are naturally attracted to how questions. How does this thing work? Whereas
Hmm.
other people are naturally attracted to why questions, like why are things this way as opposed to something else. Right.
Hmm.
And when I was going through, high school, I always thought, oh, the sciences are great for answering the how questions, but they're not good at answering the why questions. Why is it this way? And then when I found evolution, that just blew my mind because it was like, oh, wait a second. Now science can answer these why questions. Why is it this way as opposed to some other way? So
Hmm.
that would make sense. So I had always thought about some people wanting to investigate the how, how does the mind work? And other people liking the why questions of, well, why is the mind that way as opposed to some other way? And that just being the result, the cause of that confusion, people not realizing that people were asking a different question. But David, your hypothesis is really intriguing that instead because we're trying to read each other's minds, their intentions, figuring out what their character is like. Can we predict, is that person going to cooperate with me? Are they going to screw me over? That, that might be why people are looking at those kind of the why questions. There's a potential signaling argument here too. People might be hesitant to accept these functional questions for altruism, because if I say people are nice because niceness pays off,
right?
What are you going to interpret about me
right
and my actions? Suddenly, if I'm nice to you, you're going to be like, what's in it for you? Why are you helping me? So there's a signaling element where people might want to, not promote this functionalist logic. So I think maybe the same thing when it comes to, aggression, right? Aggression sometimes brings benefits. You have resources, yoink, they're mine. But if you talk about, well, organisms will sometimes fight for resources because it's their main means of getting resources cheaper sometimes than gathering it themselves, people start being like, wait a second, are you that kind of person who's going to take my stuff? So there may be a signaling aspect. And I mean, maybe we should start testing this. Are people more likely to reject functionalist approaches when others are watching and potentially judging them for espousing a functionalist view?
No, that's
and do they actually do they get judged? So if I espouse a Darwinian functionalist explanation for altruism, are people going to judge me as a less altruistic and caring, compassionate person? That would also be really interesting to test empirically. I suspect, I mean, I have a hunch that it's probably correct.
Yeah.
But it's a question that I've been increasingly interested in is why is there this conflict between the functional Darwinian level of analysis and the level of analysis that we use to judge each other and try to shape how others judge us? So why couldn't I just say that the reason that I'm helping you is because I want to be seen as a good cooperative partner, or I want you to reciprocate, or I have a stake in your welfare and I want to make sure that you can cooperate with me in the future? Why, when I say those things, would that license the negative inference about me, as opposed to me just saying that I'm doing it, just because it's intrinsically fulfilling or rewarding or something like that?
I think it's because we're trying to predict others' likelihood of cooperation, but that includes how likely are you to cooperate with me when it's not in your immediate interest to do so. And so, like, a lot of the work I do is on reputation and people gaining a reputation for cooperation. What we're ultimately trying to assess is how competent are you, like how able are you to produce benefits for me or for others, but also how willing are you to produce those benefits. And I think that's where there's signaling behind both of them. But when you're talking about, I am helping because I will get a good reputation for doing so, that indicates to you that I'm not doing it because I value you. I'm doing it just because I'm watched. And if I'm not watched, I'm not going to do it. Whereas if I genuinely value your welfare, I will help you whether people are watching or not. Right? The most common example in humans would be parents and their kids. Dave, I'm sure you can relate to this. The shit that you do for your kid is intense, especially
David
in those
has
first 5
even
years.
younger child. Yeah. So yeah, we
Sorry?
both.
That's true.
David has also even a younger daughter than.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So yeah.
So
we're
you're
both
even more in this. You are even more investing, and they won't even remember those first 5 years. Right? You will help your child even if nobody is watching because you love that little bastard.
Yeah, I love it. It's the best thing ever. Just hook it to my veins. That is the best.
Yeah. And that's a very powerful motivator, to be so concerned for somebody's welfare that you'll help them even if it doesn't seem to pay off now, even if nobody is watching. And it'd be the same with our friends. Like if you think for a second about your really close friends, is there a friend who if they were suddenly at risk of dying, you would help them even if you were sworn to secrecy and no one would ever know that you would help them. Is there anybody in your life, where you would do that for? And I think many of us would probably be like, yeah, there are some people where I would save them even if nobody would ever know. And it's
Mm.
because we genuinely value them as friends. And that's a powerful thing, that to care for somebody that deeply, that's what's going on in the brain. What I would want to know was, why does that get into the brain in the first place? But then if you can communicate that, if you can somehow signal, hey man, I love your brother and I will get your back no matter what. Like, that's a very powerful thing to communicate, makes one a valuable partner. But at the same time, it's going to be hard to fake. And
Mhm.
if somebody is saying, oh, I'm just doing this because I look good, what that tells me is they don't actually value my well-being. They don't really have a stake in my welfare. They just have a stake in appearing nice.
Right. If I
Mm.
can sort of, let me make sure I can sort of translate or say it in a different way to make sure everyone's understanding, including myself, which is that um, the our evolved psychology is by default interpreting explanations for cooperation as descriptions of underlying motivations.
Mhm.
And so a scientist who comes along and who distinguishes between proximate and ultimate, when they start talking about the evolutionary reasons why something's happening, which requires talking about fitness benefits by definition, because that's all we're allowed to postulate in
Mhm.
terms of like what we know about how biological complexity occurs given the logic of differential reproductive success. So given that, when that scientist starts talking about benefits, it's read by our intuitive evolved psychology as a motivation that detracts from quote unquote genuine cooperation or altruism. And it's misunderstood as indicating that this a person will be less likely to be altruistic in the sense in which they'll be less likely to provide benefits or cooperate, or more likely to free ride under certain circumstances. So it was a really long, complicated sentence. So I'm not sure I did any translating, but the bottom line thing is, it would be sort of the example of an evolutionary explanation makes it sound like you're saying somebody has an ulterior motive, as
Yes.
opposed to no, their evolved psychology is going to do all the things you would expect them to do when they're genuinely feeling altruistic and cooperative. I'm not saying they're going to do any less. I'm just explaining why they have that intrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think that's a good translation of all of that. So you have us, wanting to detect other people's motivations and why they're doing stuff, um, and highlighting those selective benefits makes it sound like ulterior motives. And so, you're right. Perhaps people who say that, who highlight those, will be viewed as more Machiavellian, more likely to defect. That's a great hypothesis. That, hey, like,
Mm.
let's go test this as soon as this podcast is over. We'll design some studies to test that hypothesis. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's I think a good summary.
Could I take a slightly different angle on what might be going on here?
Mhm.
So, Pat, you've done wonderful work trying to solve this Darwinian problem of altruism. Why do organisms ever help other organisms? And one explanation is what's known as kin selection, where
Mhm.
organisms help their genetic relatives because the gene for helping is often in the organism that is helped.
Mhm.
Um, and then other explanations involve reciprocity. The helper
Mhm.
is likely to get helped in return.
Yep.
Reputation. If you're helped, you're seen as a good helper and you're more likely to be helped and to be chosen as a relationship partner.
Mhm.
So there are all these beautiful explanations, and there's one more recent and more interesting explanation for altruism, which is what we might call stakeholder
Yes.
altruism, where
Yeah.
you're not helping to because they're genetically related, you're not helping to get reciprocated, you're not helping for reputational benefits, you're helping because you have an intrinsic stake in the
Mhm.
person's well-being
Yes.
because their mere existence, their mere survival and flourishing is correlated with your biological fitness. So the
Yes.
healthier and the more well-off they are, the better able they're going to the better able they'll be to help you and provide benefits to you and cooperate with you. Their mere existence is a boost for your fitness. So you have a genuine stake in them. So the best example of stakeholder altruism would be helping your children, for example. In that case, the stake would be genetic. But there
Yes.
are other kinds of stakeholder
Mhm.
altruism. If you have some talent that is irreplaceable and that nobody else has, if you're the only person who knows which mushrooms are poisonous or whatever, if you die, then all that knowledge is lost. And so I have a reason to keep you alive just to gain access to that knowledge.
Mhm.
So that's a different kind of stakeholder altruism. So that's a long-winded way of getting to what I think might be going on, is that there are different candidate explanations for altruism,
Mhm.
and we often have an interest in trying to paint our altruism or frame our altruism as stakeholder altruism, even
Mm.
when it might not be. And
Mm.
so, and because it's in our interest to describe it that way. It's better if you think that I have a stake in you, then you're going to be more disposed to help me. You're going to have a stake in my welfare in return. And so there
Yes.
might be an incentive to try to deceptively or strategically frame our motives as stakeholder motives.
Mhm.
When in reality they might be motivated by, say, reputational concerns or reciprocity concerns, or something else. So what might be going on is that when we give a Darwinian explanation of the fitness benefits in terms of reciprocity or reputation, we're giving a it seems like we're giving a different proximate explanation for the behavior that is less desirable than the pure stakeholder reason. And so I might expect that if we explain a person's behavior in Darwinian terms, in terms of stakeholder altruism, that you actually might not get those adverse inferences about the person's character. It's only those other kinds of Darwinian explanations relating to reciprocity and reputation that you might start to get those adverse inferences. What do you think about that?
That's really interesting. I mean, I'll have to check whether people's reactions to when I speak about this start to change now that I'm looking more at this stakeholder altruism rather than the
Mm.
reputation based, and whether people start looking, stop looking at me skeptically,
Yeah,
when I'm talking about stake. But that's possibly it. I mean,
yeah.
I agree that there's this benefit to framing one's interest in terms of stake. And just to back up for people who aren't as familiar with this idea of having a stake in somebody's welfare, you describe it as though it's a new thing, but it really isn't.
Hmm.
I mean, people have been talking about this for almost 40
Yeah,
years.
mutualisms,
Sorry?
right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Mutualisms.
mutualisms,
yeah. They haven't been
Richard Donner
talking
called
about
it
it
pseudo
enough, though. Yeah,
reciprocity.
yeah,
John Tooby and Lita
yeah.
Cosmides had a great paper
Hmm.
in '96 on irreplaceability,
Hmm.
where they call it solving the banker's paradox. So people have been
Yeah.
talking about this idea for a while, but
Banger,
it's
as
just,
David says.
Oh,
Banger
yeah.
right?
paper.
Wonderful paper.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good paper. David
Yeah.
calls good papers bangers, which I think is hilarious.
It's
I
one of
love
my
it.
favorite words.
Yeah,
Anyway,
banger.
continue.
Sorry, Pat.
um, but yeah, like there's at least 5 or 6 different names for this same phenomena that different people have come up with, but it
Mm,
Mhm.
hasn't really coalesced into it. I prefer Gilbert Roberts' phrase of stake and stakeholder, because I think that sums it up
Mhm.
nicely.
Yeah.
But yeah, the idea that you can have a vested interest in somebody else. The example that I like to use best is, imagine there is a tree that gives you shade,
Mhm.
and you really need that shade. Well, you have an interest in watering that tree. You have an interest in protecting that tree from herbivores and from pests so that it can continue to produce the shade that you need.
right,
This is not reciprocity. The tree is not growing leaves in order to benefit you. The tree is just doing its thing.
right.
Mhm.
But because its thing benefits you, there should be selection on you to look out for that tree so it can continue to do things to benefit you. Selection for you to be altruistic towards that tree so that it can continue to exist. And we can have all sorts of stake in other individuals. So if one person's a good hunter who tends to bring home a lot of food for the rest of the group, well, everybody else has a vested interest in that person remaining healthy. If they get injured, everybody else has a vested interest in making sure they're fed so they can get back out there and keep producing food. Somebody has useful knowledge. Again, yeah, you benefit from them being around and in good enough condition to share that. If you and I have a reciprocal relationship, right? You are selling stuff to me that I am then selling elsewhere, right? This is a purely economic exchange, but if something happens to you, there goes my business. Therefore, I have an incentive to help you and keep you well so that my business can continue. So, I benefit from keeping you around. And so, that's very beneficial. But I think, David, you're right with that. I also have an interest in conveying to you, hey, man, I do need you. I do benefit from you, and I am going to get your back if you need it. Why? Because then if you see that and you know that I'm going to get your back, now you have a higher interest in my well-being. Because if I'm going to be there when you need it, you want to make sure that I'm around and able and willing to help.
Right. That makes sense. And that's also why people are so sensitive. I mean, Pat, do you have data on this especially for David and I, we're interested in like polyadic, like 3 or more. So it's one thing, Pat, to say this, but if you say that to David, what you just said, when we should just record that and play it back. I got your back. Like, it's just like, it's lovely to hear. But if you say that to David, but then you, me, and David get together, and then you take my side because David and I are having a fight, like that should be something that David should be really vigilant for. It should be really uncomfortable. Is there data on that?
So, let me just see. I mean, what you would expect, it's hard to say if I am helping genuinely, is that because I value people in general? And so to what extent does my helping towards David predict my helping towards Dave,
Right.
you, the other Dave? And if I just value other people really well, or I don't value myself that much, then yes, my helping of you will predict my helping of somebody else. But if there's a conflict scenario where the two of you are in conflict with each other, then my helping of one of you is going to be a negative predictor of my willingness to help somebody else. So It's always hard to distinguish between, is this a general helping or is this tailored towards a specific person?
Right. Like, just as an example, like I want every listener to imagine their political outgroup. And then imagine like Pat helping somebody who's a member of that political art group versus Pat helping somebody who's just neutral or a member of your political in-group. The way that's colored emotionally is very different, exactly for the reason you just said.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. So there are basically 2 approaches to friendship that exist. One is what you just talked about, the banker's paradox, stakeholder altruism, that friends are people who have a stake in each other's well-being. And the other approach is called the alliance hypothesis, pioneered by Peter Discioli, which he argues that friends are there to sort of take our side in conflicts and have our back against others should conflict erupt. And it seems like what you're saying is that there might not actually be a difference between those 2 approaches, because if I have a higher stake in Pat than Dave, then I'm automatically going to take Pat's side if Pat gets into a conflict with Dave. So this stakeholder idea, assuming that my stake in everyone isn't equal, which is, then automatically it's the same thing as saying that the people for whom I have a stake in their welfare are going to be my allies, by definition.
Yeah, I don't see these as conflicting explanations, and never did, even before we started talking about stakeholder. You could describe some of this just in terms of reciprocity, right? Like, I help you, you help me. I share food with you, you share food with me. Well, one of the other ways that we reciprocate help is I help you in, coalitional conflict. You help me in coalitional conflict. So we've long talked about this in terms of reciprocity and how much, you scratch my back, I scratch your back is important. And I think, I think that underlies this coalitional support model too. Is a lot about reciprocity, and I don't think Peter Discioli would disagree. I
Mhm.
suspect he would
Yeah.
he would agree with this, that it is
Yeah.
based on reciprocity as opposed to some other phenomenon. Um, I think what's new is that we're looking at that it's not just about making sure that person sees that you help, but some helping you'd be willing to do even if they
Mhm.
don't see,
Yeah.
because you benefit from their existence. But
Yeah.
I think this is an exciting new direction to take this in, is to look at, well, if I have a differential stake in each of you, to what extent does that predict which of you I'm going to support in a conflict?
Mm.
And it should depend not just on my stake in you, but it may also depend upon your outside options.
Mhm.
Right. And this gets into
So
the market idea,
this
which
is
I
where
think
we
is
get
a
into the
really great
markets.
idea. Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
if I'm your only friend, well, even if I get that other person's back against you, if you got no one else you can ask for help, you might still, you know, value me
Mm.
just because you have no other options. And we see stuff like this in other species. So there's some great work by Redwan Bashari, among the cleaner fish. So he studies cleaner fish, which go up and they clean the mucus off host fishes.
Yeah,
But
go inside the mouth. So they're a
they go
little
right
fish.
inside the mouth. Yeah, yeah,
And they're like they
Yeah.
could easily get eaten by this bigger fish because the bigger fish would have to close its mouth and it would have a
yeah, yeah,
free
yeah.
lunch.
Mhm.
But the cleaner fish, they can also cheat, because instead of eating the parasites from inside of the mouth, they can eat the host's mucus, which
Mhm.
it doesn't like, and the whole like jolts and it doesn't like that, and will sometimes chase the cleaner, right? So, um, but then you can look at, red ones looked at, well, who are these cleaner fish giving good service to? And not only are they giving better service when there's another fish, client waiting in line, right? Because if they give bad service and their client jolts, well, the observer might just say, "All right, I'm getting bad service here. Let's go somewhere else." But they'll also, depending on whether that the person, the person, anthropomorphism, right there.
Mhm.
The other fish who's watching, what are its outside options?
Mm.
If that is of a species that is like, that one is only on my territory, you can wait. I'll make you wait and I'll service this other guy first. But if that other guy has lots of territories it could go to, oh, you know what? Yes, coming right up, sir. I will service you right away, sir. They are much faster. So, uh, you know, the extent to which somebody's going to be nice is going to depend not just on how much stake they have, but what that other individual's outside options are.
It's so
Mhm.
interesting. Yeah. And so this
And if you
idea,
want to talk about Machiavellianism, right there, holy crap, I sound Machiavellianism when I'm describing that. So anybody listening to this is going to be like, wow, that Barclay dude, I don't trust him as far as I can throw
which is ironic because I would actually, I don't know. I don't know if I want to go so far, but I think peeling back the layers of sort of the logic for this. I mean, this came up, I think we were talking to Chris Von Ruden. We were talking about, and I think this is important to say again, because you can't overemphasize this. We want people to give to kids who are dying around the world, right? Like
Right.
nobody thinks that like people who have more than enough shouldn't be giving to kids, right? Who are dying, and that's a horrible thing. But if we want to actually help as many kids as possible, we need to be accurate about what's the proximate motivation,
Yes.
Mhm.
and
Yes.
how do we get that proximate motivation activated as much as possible? And it might feel good to just say, well, it's just altruistic for the
Mhm.
reasons we already talked about. But
Right.
if the science or ways that we try to get people to help other people assumes that that's the motivation or the cue structure of the proximate psychology, and that's wrong, we're allowing wanting to feel good about ourselves and signal that we're all nice people getting in the way of helping actual people, actual kids who are like dying. So I think it's really important to say that there is virtue in talking about what the logic is and why there's benefits. And I totally, yes, you're right. And it's funny, but also like genuinely, I do think that it's a really good habit. I mean, even for myself, like, why am I doing what I'm doing as a sort of check on does it make sense or not? Like, I know I'm helping my son. I love helping my son, even when it's a huge cost to me.
Mhm.
I know why I'm doing it, and that's all cool, right? But there might be other situations where I think about why I'm doing something. It feels good. Like I always use the example of like, like just like derogating an outgroup that may or may not even really exist. Like
Mhm.
what consequence is that having on the world? And is it a good consequence? So I think thinking about the actual costs and benefits is helpful.
I agree, and that's I think one of the most useful points about a functional perspective and looking at, well, what would select for this behavior is to understand what are the deep, the I don't want to say motivations because it makes it sound like people are
Right.
actually thinking about that,
Right.
but
But the
like
relationships in the world, like what outcomes does it cause in the world, right?
what are the selective pressures that
Yeah.
result in this behavior? It allows us to tailor any any policies to actually hit the right thing as opposed to hitting the wrong thing.
Right.
Right.
And I think your example of loving your child is a great example of that. So say for example you were to find evidence that um, and this, I guess, going back to some of the work done by my PhD advisors, Martin Daly, Margot Wilson, then when they're looking at parental love and step parents,
Right.
right? And an evolutionary perspective would say that people are going to love their children more than other people's children.
Right.
Right. I have a genetic stake in this child. I don't have a genetic stake in that child. I'm going to love my child much more and do much more for them. As a consequence, people are going to be not as careful about other people's kids, including stepchildren, not as careful and not as restrained and willing to put up with the bullshit that the kids drive us through if it's somebody else's kid.
Right.
So if you were to find different rates of neglect or abuse or something else towards stepchildren, um, one perspective would be to say, oh, it's because the step parental script has not been correctly identified, and we need to like really define this social role a lot more so that step parents know that that it's okay for them to invest deeply in stepchildren, and to sacrifice just as much as a parent does. However, another perspective that views parental investment as very costly, and I love my children, and you know what, I'm sorry, your kid's nice, but I don't, I'm not going to take a bullet for them like I would for my own kid.
Right.
That perspective might say, okay, yeah, you know what, if you start dumping too many expectations on somebody else, that might actually exacerbate the problem.
Right.
Because but part of it
Mhm.
is a conflict. I'm expected to invest so much in this kid who is not mine. And oh, now you're asking the social role. You're expecting me to do much more. That'll actually make the problem worse.
Right.
So,
Mhm.
so it's an example of where maybe instead of redefining the role, we should be more like, okay, clarifying and say, okay, you know what, it's okay if I'm nice towards this kid, but I'm not gonna take a bullet for them. And I'm sorry, but
Right.
that's how I feel.
Yeah, it's a great
That
example.
might
Yeah.
help reduce the level of conflict within those relationships.
Right. It's a great example. I'm glad that you brought up Martin and Margot too. We should talk a little bit about them because I think you're the first person from that uh, academic family we've had on so far. But it's a really good example too because it sounds you could I am sure this happened too, and I think it did, of people pushing back against this idea because it makes it sound like, well, all step parents are going to be abusive, which is not at all what it's saying, right?
Correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
it is not what it's saying, but that is how many people have interpreted
Right.
what they have said.
Right. And it's almost the opposite in the sense of it's sort of just being clear-eyed about, as you said, all kids, it's just a lot of cost. And so at the threshold at which any human will lose their temper, it's just going to be a design feature that threshold is going to be further back for if the psychology is getting a cue that this is your own kid versus someone else's.
Yeah.
And so it's just accepting that actually the people who are step parents are doing this incredible thing. They're
Yes.
actually taking on more cost and they're more likely to feel more frustrated, all else equal. And so, number one, we should just be aware of that individually and also socially. Like maybe we should provide more support to step parents or like whatever you think, but like just being aware that like, not blaming step parents for being more frustrated either themselves or structurally providing them something. So we're just aware and sober that uh, it's hard to raise kids. And if you're not
Mhm.
related to the kid, it's going to feel harder and you're going to, that threshold is going to just get tripped quicker, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we will put up with more crap from our kin than
Yeah.
we would from a non-family member with whom we have like an equivalent relationship. Like,
Right.
yes, our siblings might frustrate us at times, but imagine you were stuck in the house with some other random person, just like imagine a first year university. Sometimes and you're thrown in a residence. Sometimes you get along really well, but sometimes you really don't. And to what extent do you keep in touch with somebody? We're given the level of contact, we're much more favorably disposed towards our kin, and so we're going to be more favorably disposed to our own children as well. So it's
Yeah.
part of the same phenomenon.
Yeah. All so equal. Yeah.
Actually,
Hmm.
it's worth just a brief digression if you did want to hear more about Martin and Margot.
Oh, we'd love to.
This
Yeah.
this is one of these great cases of an evolutionary perspective sometimes being twisted. The story gets twisted as it goes along. The perspective always being people are going to love their own kids more than other people's kids. Um, but then you hear how it gets talked about in the popular press, and you hear stories about like lions killing cubs and all this other stuff. You hear
Yeah.
people saying, "Oh, well, human parents, step parents have evolved to kill their stepkids." But when you go back and read the
Whoa.
original Martin Margot
That's
Wilson, not
crazy.
only have they
Yeah.
never said that, but
Mm.
they have always explicitly argued against it. Like, human beings are not like lions. Here's why we would not expect step parents to kill their children, habitually. And most times, many step parent relationships are perfectly warm and lovely, and they point that out. But it's always twisted as though it's this adaptations for step parental homicide, sometimes even by members within the evolutionary psychology community who
Mm.
are, citing them, trying to do so favorably, but they're not always reading the original, and they're citing this research as saying something it's not, saying that there are adaptations to kill specific individuals, that is just not supported by the data.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, and we've talked a lot about on this so far that it's really, I mean, thinking about design,
Yeah,
proximate design, and what we talked about, like a setting on a threshold, all else equal, right? So it's not
yeah,
even just that
policy.
like you love your siblings more than anyone else. It's just like if you imagine the way your siblings interact with you versus you imagine the same person interacting with you in the exact same way, but they're not your sibling, which is not possible, but like that's the theory, is that you're gonna like be cool with your sibling more than that random person, all else equal, right? Like that's the idea. And so like this idea of a threshold or like thinking about design, yeah, it's hard for people. I think one of the themes we're talking about is that if you don't get some training and thinking about we're talking about design and
Mhm.
aspects on the design, and this goes back to the cooperation thing, not about a behavior, then it's hard for people to place sort of like, well, where do I put free ride or where do I put a benefit? Where do I put that you're gonna like this threshold, like non-kin a little bit less? And then it just gets put in one of the folk psychological entries, like, well, it's just going to be behavior or it's an underlying ulterior motive. So I'm not surprised people are confused about these things.
Mhm.
I I want to suggest that maybe there's more intelligence to people's animosity toward evolutionary explanations for altruism, and then it may not just be, a stupid misfiring of folk psychology.
Good.
So
Yeah.
let's take the example of, donating to starving kids on the other side of the world. Let's say I'm,
Mhm.
donating to Oxfam, and
Which
let's
isn't
assume for this.
Oh no,
Oh, it is.
sorry. Oxfam, I thought, no, we can cut that out. There's something that's in Santa Barbara,
Oh,
but it's not Oxfam. It's something else. But yeah,
oh
it's a
well, it's
great
it's a,
example.
it's a good charity. Yeah,
Oxfam is a great charity. Yes, great.
yeah. Yeah.
If you're listening, please donate to Oxfam.
Please,
That's our
please donate.
commercial. We have no
Yeah.
commercials. That's yeah.
Maybe we should do a commercial for a charity every episode.
We should.
But let's
Yeah.
assume for the sake of argument that I am donating to Oxfam mostly for reputational reasons, that I want to show others that I'm a really kind and generous person. I want to try to signal that I have a stake in everyone's welfare, even people's welfare who are on the other side of the world who I don't know. That's just how big my heart is, that
Mhm.
I just have a stake in everyone. And that makes me a really attractive social partner. So let's assume for the sake of argument that that's my goal
Mhm.
in donating to Oxfam. Well, if you come along and say, well, no, actually, probably your motive is mostly reputational, that you're trying to signal that you're a good cooperative partner. Well, all of a sudden, I lose the benefits
Yes.
of my signal because people are no longer going to view that as a sign that I have a stake in those kids' welfare. They're going to view it as me trying to look good. And so the mere awareness that I'm trying to look good makes me not look good. And if you come along and point out the fact that actually I'm just trying to look good, well, you're going to ruin my chances of looking good.
Mhm.
And if we create common knowledge of self-interested motives, well, that could destroy the social incentives necessary to produce the pro-social behavior. And so that it may be that the pushback against these kinds of explanations are coming from a strategic place. What do you think
Yeah,
about that?
I absolutely agree with that. So I put this. I wrote a paper a while back, looking at what are some of the limits,
Hmm.
strengths and limits of harnessing,
Yeah.
a reputation. And one of them was that if you highlight what the reputational benefits are, that might decrease the reputational benefits. Saying exactly what you just said. And
Hmm.
then other researchers that came at the same idea and showing that if you show that somebody benefits from their generosity, people will then judge that person not as well.
Hmm.
So one person acts nicely, and nothing particular happens, and another person acts nicely and gets rewarded for it. Okay, well, what do you think about that first person or that second person? People, they don't like the second one as much, the one who got something out of it. We tend to infer ulterior motives. And so, whether this is because we infer our ulterior motives, or whether it's some like law of conservation of benefits or something. Oh, they've already benefited. Okay, in that case, I'm not gonna reward them more. Um, Either way, once we start highlighting that, you're absolutely right. That might decrease the benefits, which then gives an incentive to anybody who does do the public publicly cooperative acts. It gives them an incentive to disavow such
Hmm.
reputational benefits and saying, no, no, no,
Yes.
that's not what happens.
Yeah,
Whether they're
totally.
doing it for signaling or whether they're genuine, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Right?
Well, it
They
also,
have a
yeah.
vested interest in saying that no, that's not the reason.
Right. It also implies that if we want to increase the incentive for, say, giving to charity, then we should disavow the reputational benefits of giving to charity, even if they truly exist.
Yeah, yeah.
Or just
I'm
educate everybody about this so that there's not common knowledge that audiences will look poorly on it if everybody
Mhm.
realizes that the reason why we're all doing it is for or the ultimate reason is reputational benefit. And in fact, if you give enough people that information, they might say, actually, I'm disincentivizing giving if I criticize reputational benefits. And it's I mean, one of the things I like about an evolutionary approach is we're not allowed to say like we don't like ulterior motives. Like the reason why, like that's approximate description. The ultimate reason would be that if it is yoked to a particular benefit, it's exactly what Pat said earlier. It predicts in the future, unless that benefit is somehow baked into the structure of the world, which it kind of isn't, then it's not a good predictor of future benefits. So, for example, the only reason Pat benefited me was because it was going to be a reputational benefit in this one particular thing. If that same benefit isn't going to hold for you, David, or somebody else,
Mhm.
then it's just you're going to Pat is it's less likely that Pat is a locus of benefits to others, right? So like the prediction is that ulterior motive version of Pat who got a benefit is going to be less generous than intrinsically generous Pat, which is coming back to what we talked about earlier. And people don't like that second version as much, all else equal,
Mhm.
right? Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, but if the reputational benefit itself comes from the perception that Pat is intrinsically motivated.
Exactly. No, I hear you.
Yeah.
No, I know. No, it's like we can
Keep
either have a
talking about
stable
this. Let this idea
equilibrium.
about intrinsically
Yeah.
motivated Pat
Yeah.
Yeah.
just circulate
Yeah.
amongst them.
Exactly. So no, David, I totally agree. There's two
Yeah.
stable equilibriums. Either everybody
Yeah.
understands the ultimate proximate thing, or we
Yeah.
don't talk about the ultimate. Is basically what we're saying.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, there's definitely I'm aware of this irony of
Yeah.
saying, hey, we need to make sure people are aware of the reputational benefits, but also, oh crap, that might undermine the whole endeavor.
Yeah.
Maybe we. get it out there, but that idea out there, but at least so people start creating more opportunities
Yeah.
for people to others to benefit from reputation, but without really stressing that everybody does benefit from this. Because I mean, I think we do want a lot to be more more public, right? Shed some light in order to decrease bad behavior. Because people are much more assholes when they're anonymous. And I think the internet is a fantastic example of that. Because basically any domain we've looked, people are nicer when people are nicer when they're watched than when they're not. So we want to create more opportunities for people to benefit from having a good reputation. And we want people to know that, hey, maybe we should create such opportunities, but perhaps we don't want to highlight that, this person who's being nice is just doing so in order to be nice.
Right.
Because you're right. Yeah, that would undermine it.
Yeah. And I think there's also sort of structural issues that run up against the stakeholder evolved psychology too.
Mm-hmm.
So like this idea that sort of like the stakeholder idea that we had earlier is sort of, like why I care about this tree because it's providing something to me. That also, I think, even runs within the exploitation, like whatever the trade-off is. It can be a benefit, but can also be a reason for me to not be exploitative. So, for example,
yes,
if we're all in a village, people have this naive idea that, nature is sort of red tooth and claw, and it is in some ways. But like, why wouldn't it be evolutionarily beneficial for me to just take all of Pat's stuff?
Yeah.
Right. Like every time he got something, and it's because Pat is evolved to not like that, and so it's going to make Pat belligerent, right? And so even if he doesn't know who took his stuff, he's going to be grumpier, more belligerent. It might kind of come back to me. And so sort of the idea that we're all going to sort of like monitor and be okay with that people are sort of okay and not feeling really, really exploited would be something that would be selected for. I mean, there's other dynamics related to that, but I think that a lot of sort of modern life, and especially like advertising, like I've been looking recently because I'm teaching intro psych and like the effects of advertising. And there's sort of a lot of institutional selection pressures on advertising to sort of motivate people to sort of get resources. And so the one way to do that is to make people insecure, but it's also to hide like of the resources they do have, but it's also to sort of hide the costs that getting those things pose on other people. So for example, my iPhone, nobody's going to sort of advertise the working conditions of the workers. I don't know what those are recently. I know there's been talk of that, but like that's an example of the institutional structure is not going to be at all telling me about how my actions are going to exploit people. It's only going to tell me the things that are going to motivate me to get stuff, right? And so that's an example of our natural evolved psychology might worry about exploiting people and have this sort of stakeholder psychology, but that we have this institutional structure of like advertising that's sort of by design, and it's nobody's pernicious motivation. It's just what kind of advertising gets selected for, and sort of filtering out a lot of stakeholder cues. So one example might be, and I think charities do this, is sort of the opposite, which is sort of say, look, there's this person, and you're better off if they're better off, right? Like they're not gonna. That's one idea. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think having an interest in somebody else's welfare, you're absolutely right, will make people less exploitative, right? I mean, one of the reasons you don't just come and take my stuff is not just because I might retaliate, but if you benefit from my presence in some way, even if it's just like I'm another set of eyes who's watching for predators and outgroups,
right?
And you see this in other species, right? Like where you benefit from having an extra group member because that's somebody else who might find a bonanza of food, or somebody else who can watch for predators, and so you'll show cooperation towards other group members simply because, hey, I benefit from being part of this larger herd, and so that can work in humans too. You benefit from having a group size of a certain amount, and so you have some stake in somebody else's welfare. Whether or not we can harness that in order to to get people to feel more concerned about people, in different political groups. We are all one country. It's not our party and their party. It's all of us versus, them, or all of humanity versus the Martians, or whatever, right? We all now have a stake in each other's well-being. Some people have argued that this is one of the beneficial effects of trade. International trade, now suddenly we have a vested interest in the people in that other country, because they are producing the thing that we are trading for. And so if we want our cheap, bountiful lifestyle, we've got to keep the people in that country in a good enough condition to continue to trade with them. And we have less incentive to exploit them and go to war against them if we are trading with them, because if we do, well, whatever it is we were getting from them, we ain't getting anymore. So these are ways to perhaps foster the stakeholder idea and use it to get people to be more cooperative and less exploitative towards others, even across traditional group boundaries, across countries or whatnot.
Yeah, I think a good maybe bottom line thing is sort of be skeptical of anything that tries to suggest to you that like certain people aren't stakeholders, right? Like it suggests that they're maybe trying to sell you something, or there's exploitation going on.
Yes, people may try to exploit you into helping them exploit somebody else.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a lot of...
To sort of loop back to, so at the beginning we talked about, you've got all this work on evolution of cooperation. Do you agree that, I mean, you're a humble person, I would say, but do you agree that sort of you've really, I don't know how to ask this question without it sounding like,
and I won't know how to answer it without sounding,
exactly. So I would just say it, like, I think, can you characterize for people how these solutions, so like, I'm sure some people are wondering, like, well, what's the problem with cooperation, right? And so can you talk a little bit about, because we're not going to go in through all of the work you've done, but let's just assume that Pat Barclay has sort of single-handedly, roughly solved the problems of cooperation with colleagues.
I'm not even going to come
too far off, honestly.
No,
exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
So people have been looking at the problem of cooperation for, I don't know what year, 2025, let's say, 100 and, how long since Origin of the Species, 1859?
Yeah.
So we're talking, 165 years, 66 years. So the idea, of why one organism might incur a cost on itself in order to confer a benefit on another organism. I mean, people have been studying this for ages. Like Darwin pointed out this idea when he's like, these bees are frustrating me. Why are they helping, sacrificing themselves for the hive? This doesn't make sense. He even said if one founded an organism were to sacrifice itself solely for a member of another species, this would destroy my theory. Or I think of something he said, right? Great conditions for falsification right there. But because on the surface, this helping others would seem to be maladaptive. You are incurring a cost, which means, well, that's effort, time and effort and resources that you're not putting into your own survival. You're not putting into your reproduction and the proliferation of your genes. And so if there were somebody else who were not doing that, who were getting a free ride on your cooperation, who were defecting on this social contract, well, they would be saving the cost. Therefore, they would be having more offspring. Therefore, their genes for selfishness would proliferate at the expense of your cooperative genes. So that's the basic, the basic puzzle that everybody is trying to address. And different researchers over the decades have come up with different explanations. So, David, you mentioned kin selection being a big one. One of biologist William Hamilton's great insights is the idea that if there were a gene or set of genes that influenced altruistic behavior, towards relatives, those relatives are statistically likely to carry a copy of the same genes or set of genes. Okay, so we've got kin selection there, and that's how gene or set of genes for altruism could proliferate. People came along a little bit later and started looking at reciprocity, where if you and I take turns helping each other. I help you, you help me. I scratch your back, I pick all the parasites off your back, and you pick all the parasites off my back. Well, we both benefit from that. We now have, both of us now have fewer parasites than anybody else. And so that can be selected for. And, the idea put forward by Robert Trivers in 1971, some great early work on that using computer simulations to show that in a world where organisms can do that and can take turns of reciprocating, but at the same time discriminating against defectors, against those who don't cooperate, well, those sort of cooperative strategies can do really, really well because they get into long-term mutually beneficial relationships. And at the same time, they don't get taken advantage of for long. And so, people who are familiar with this will recognize I'm talking about Robert Axelrod's work on the prisoner's dilemma and the tit for tat strategy of I will cooperate, and then I will just afterwards I'll do whatever you did. If you cooperate with me, I'll cooperate with you. If you defect on me, I'll defect on you. And that sort of behavior evolves by natural selection. And like that's what got me into this stuff in the first place. Like I was a psychology student, and this is somewhat interesting, but I was also taking biology, and then I heard about this computer simulation where cooperation starts winning and starts evolving, and here we have like nice guys finishing first. And I heard that and just holy fuck, evolution is cool. And
put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah, exactly. Holy fuck, evolution is cool. Yeah, I mean, that's what got me, it just blew my mind as an undergrad. And I was like, I love evolution, but I also like psychology. Can I combine them into some sort of, I don't know, evolutionary psychology? Turns out the field already existed. I'm like, all right, I might as well join then.
How did you, at the risk of doing an origin story, how did you discover? So you just said you came across the Axelrod. Did you already know about Martin, Margot, or Lita?
No, I came across them afterwards when I was just looking through for graduate school.
Okay.
And their stuff, seemed really interested, and their stuff came recommended. Like, Richard Dawkins had his interviews with 5 different, evolutionists or whatever. Or, so somebody else did an interview with 5 different evolutionists, one of which was Dawkins. And it's like, what do you think of evolutionary psychology? And it's like, I think it's got good promise, especially this stuff by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson.
Oh, that's great.
Well, it's been recommended by the guy who created this video of Nice Guys Finish First that got me into this shit. And then I started reading their stuff and was getting frustrated because I couldn't poke holes in it. I'm like, they didn't think about this. And oh, wait, 2 paragraphs later they did. Well, what about this? Oh, wait, 2 paragraphs later they resolved that. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is actually really good. Like, I want to work with somebody who's really careful, who deals with alternative explanations. So I went to work with them. Yeah. So that's my origin story in a nutshell.
Wow, I think we got that in 3 minutes.
Yeah. There we go. See, it is possible.
Yeah, we addressed Kiki's criticism.
We'll have to figure out a way to make it so people understand what that. Yeah, we'll link to that. Yeah, exactly. That was great. But what I'm hearing is that you had. I'm going to take it away because I'm going to stay on this for a second. But you had an experience of reading stuff where you felt like it was not thorough or whole. You were finding holes in it, and this was one of the first times where that wasn't. Is that true?
Yeah. So I mean, as an undergrad, would be reading articles and be like, well, they need to do this next, or here's a crucial control condition. And I'm not talking within evolutionary psychology. I'm talking within psychology in general, and that's not trying to slag psychology in general. Because there's great work and there's not so great work everywhere, right? And so I guess I was exposed to some stuff that I thought could have gone a little bit deeper. And this was some of the first work that I read that I thought was really careful, and really addressed potential confounds. And I couldn't think of any control conditions they had missed. And that I thought was very inspiring. And that realized that that's how to do good, solid science. That's going to make sure it addresses all that those confounds and has a meaningful impact.
That's really cool because there's 2 things to say. One is that if you are listening and you're a scientist, you should do thorough control conditions because that will attract students like Pat who also do that. And 2, it makes sense that you really, the literature, I can't overemphasize how confusing it was. And
Mhm.
I think you are a group of people sort of bringing clarity to that. And I'm really glad that somebody who has this disposition to sort of see to think deeply and sort of see the problems or what control conditions are necessary, that's super needed in the cooperation literature, especially early 2000s, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. There was definitely a lot of confusion in the early 2000s. A lot of confusion over proximate and ultimate causes. Led to some particular viewpoints coming around where people would see humans behaving cooperatively in anonymous situations.
Right.
And people would say, wait a second, people are behaving cooperatively when they're anonymous. Therefore, we can't explain that with traditional explanations like kin selection, reciprocity, or reputation. We need something big and new to explain this behavior, because otherwise, why would people ever help when they're anonymous?
Right.
So there was a lot of confusion. In the end, I think a lot of that was confusion over levels of analysis, where realizing that we have this psychology for cooperation that does make us value other people, that does make us value cooperation itself. And then you can create an artificial situation where that causes somebody to behave generously when it doesn't bring them benefit. Just like you can create an artificial sweetener that triggers our desire for sugar, but doesn't provide any calories.
Right.
You can provide a new scenario where a normally adaptive mechanism won't be adaptive anymore because it's completely artificial. Our lungs are designed to extract oxygen from the air, but I can create an artificial situation where, like an all nitrogen environment, where these lungs no longer function. And you can say, oh, it's maladaptive. Our lungs are clearly not evolved for air. We're still trying to breathe when it's all nitrogen. It's like, well, no, we're just, it's a new environment. We wouldn't expect
Right.
everything to be as adaptive there.
Right. If
So
somebody
what?
was, oh, sorry, David. If somebody was running at you with an axe and you got scared and there was a big plexiglass wall that you hadn't seen and you reacted with fear, we wouldn't be like, boy, we have to explain, that person can't hurt you. So the fact that you got afraid means that we have to come up with some other explanation for why that fear mechanism exists. It's not that. It's just that we've created this weird artificial situation
Yeah.
where you can't get
Yeah.
hurt, but that's just the evolved psychology can't anticipate this weird thing we've created.
Yeah,
Sure.
roller coasters are exciting,
Yeah.
Yeah.
even though they're pretty safe. Just
Yeah.
because they're triggering all those cues of fast
Falling,
motion,
yeah.
stuff's coming at us quick.
Yeah. Okay. So I love all these analogies, but I want to drill deeper. So when you bring someone into the lab and
Yeah.
Yes.
give them this scenario where here's a chance to cooperate or give money to someone, and you're
Mhm.
totally anonymous,
Or punish a free
it
rider, right?
or punish
Like,
a free rider, whatever.
yeah.
Um, what in that scenario is analogous to the plexiglass, to the artificial sweetener, to the roller coaster? What about it is evolutionarily novel? How is it? How does the trick work?
Okay. So in the real world, many of our actions have consequences, and we have
Mhm.
social emotions that trigger behavior. We have things like guilt. If we cheat on somebody, we have emotions, like a warm glow when we help somebody else. All of these emotions are what triggers our actual behavior, right? Whatever
Mhm.
those emotions happen to be. I'm a little agnostic about what they happen to be, but other people are doing some great work examining what they are. Like Daniel Sneetzer does some great work examining what some of these emotions are.
Mhm.
Um, and so we have these emotions, and they work really well in the real world. Somebody who would feel guilty about you know screwing over a cooperative partner tends to not screw over their cooperative partner, and they tend to stay in good relationships. Where somebody who is absolutely guilt free, absolutely shame free, is more likely to get caught and disowned. At least in any environment with repeat interactions where you repeatedly meet the same people, people eventually realize, oh, that guy is really untrustworthy. So I'm not gonna trust them. So these emotions work really, really well. In a lab experiment, we create a situation where we sever the link between the action and the normal consequences. So people can come in and they can still experience the same emotions. I am feeling guilt about screwing over that stranger there. I am feeling good about helping that other person. The fairness that I value in the outside world, I value in here too. But because the researchers have made it so that no one knows what happens, and because the researchers have made it that they have no reputation, this behavior is towards complete strangers, there are no longer the social consequences that would normally occur outside the lab. And so as a result, people are still following the same the same mechanisms, the same emotions that would normally happen in real life situations, but we've changed the situation such that these behaviors no longer have the consequences that they otherwise would. And then we're surprised that people still do them anyway. But we shouldn't be surprised that people will still do these behaviors anyway, because they're still acting on the same emotions.
I want to push back on that explanation a little bit.
Okay.
Because
Please
wouldn't
do.
you? So you mentioned guilt and how it's sensitive to the costs that we impose on cooperative partners. Wouldn't you expect guilt to have design features
Mhm.
that involve recognizing the likelihood that the person is actually going to be a cooperative partner, or actually
Yeah.
is a cooperative partner, or that the person might actually know about the costs that you inflict on them? You'd think that a well-designed system of guilt would be sensitive to those variables, and introducing those variables in a lab context might affect the person's psychology. The same thing goes with, a sense of fairness, a sense of, feeling good when you help someone. You would expect the psychological machinery to be sensitive to the likely costs and benefits, to be sensitive to the potential reputational benefits or costs. So why wouldn't we expect a well-designed system to be sensitive to the information that the psychology experimenter is giving to the participant?
So this is a great question. And so part of the answer is it is somewhat responsive to these mechanisms. And this is
Hmm.
some of the
Yeah.
research that people are showing now. How much do we forgive somebody after a transgression? Well, it depends on how valuable a partner they are. If they're a more valuable partner, we've experienced more forgiveness towards them. How angry are we at a violation of trust? Well, it depends on how much of a cost they imposed on us and what they get from it. So our emotions are responsive to a lot of that, but within boundaries, right? So a couple of concepts to introduce. One is the idea of error management,
Hmm.
which is also goes by, if people are familiar with signal detection, it's a similar sort of idea where what is more costly? Is it more costly to miss an opportunity to cheat somebody, or is it more costly to get caught cheating somebody else? And in many cases, the latter is more expensive, right? There's all these expressions. It takes a lifetime to build a reputation, but it takes just a second to destroy it.
Hmm.
And this is often true, right? If you're caught cheating when you had an opportunity, people are going to distrust you, and you might never get an opportunity to reclaim that. If you get caught cheating on your spouse, they might never trust you again, and let you go out late at night with your buddies, right? Because they will suspect something. So as a result, because getting caught is so costly, we might err on the side of, okay, I don't want to risk it. So it's kind of a risky decision. So that's part of it, is that there will be some, yes, I might be more likely to cheat in this
Hmm.
anonymous situation, but I might not be completely willing, just in case.
Hmm.
And different people are going to differ. Different people are going to have a different threshold as to how certain do they need to be about their anonymity before they cheat. So that's part of it. Another part of it might be tying back to the stakeholder cooperation that we talked about earlier, where if you perceive that you have a stake in somebody's welfare, you might cooperate with them, even if you know 100% that they cannot observe. Just like you watering that tree and protecting it, even though it cannot detect that you are helping it, you will still help because if you think you have an interest in them, then you'll help them. And this is some of the work that I've done. People are more likely to anonymously help somebody if doing so will keep that person around and available to cooperate with, than if it does not affect whether that person's going to be around and available to help, right? So part of the anonymous cooperation might be some perception of stake going on there. But also, I would say we are also plastic about how we learn to deal with new situations. So if you chuck somebody in a lab environment for the first time, this is a bit of a new environment. Well, I'm going to follow the strategies that worked well for me out in the real world because I spend 99% of my time out there in the real world. Therefore, I'm going to apply all of the heuristics that work well in the real world in the lab, even though it happens to not be beneficial here, especially the first time. But the second time, I might have learned a little bit. The third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth time, I might have learned a little bit that, oh, wait a second, cooperation doesn't pay off in this new environment. And some researchers have shown that people do habituate a little bit to these artificial environments. And so if you have people giving in, an online cooperative game, how much of your money do you want to share with this other person? Well, the first time they do it, they're pretty generous. Second time, maybe not quite as much on average. Third time, even less on average. As they gradually get used to this artificial scenario, as it comprises a larger portion of the interactions, they then start to learn these heuristics of, oh, this is a new situation where the payoffs are different.
Right. Citation Internet 2025. See the internet.
Yeah. People get used to online environments and realize, oh, I can be an asshole here. Yeah. And so they do. Right. So I think that's another component of this too, is that we are plastic, but plasticity takes time. And we shouldn't overinterpret what people do the first time you throw them into an artificial environment. If you take a person who has never swum before and you throw them in the water, they're not going to do so well. If you take somebody who has learned how to deal with water, eventually you throw them in and they'll do the backstroke. But the first time is not necessarily indicative of anything.
Right. I remember even some of the first data coming out of this, we need a whole new theory of cooperation. It would be something like, and Pat, you can correct me if I'm wrong, cooperation, they would say look, there's going to be the end to this interaction. And so you would get cooperation on the y-axis is the level of cooperation, x-axis is what round it is. And what you would see is as you're going and it's further and further or getting closer to the end of cooperation, people are still cooperating, but then it starts they know this is the last round and then it goes down. And so people are cooperating less in the last round, but it's not at zero. And what people would sort of emphasize was the residual cooperation and so even in that original data, there was sensitivity to the thing ending, but they were really emphasizing the fact it just didn't go to zero right away, which I think is people were getting money by emphasizing it because they were we need to discover a brand new thing, which I think was sort of overselling the point. But yeah,
there's always an incentive to discover a brand new thing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because sometimes people will discover things that aren't new or aren't, a repackaging of something old.
Yeah, I think one way to put it is, Pat, you have been steadily doing the actual science of what a lot of very well-known people who study cooperation, the evolution of cooperation, have sort of snake oiled into. We've discovered a whole new kind of selection. And I won't name names, but you're actually doing the science of that as opposed to the flashy snake oil. Yeah.
I'm trying to avoid the snake oil. So one of my friends and colleagues, Sandeep Mishra, has a great expression that scientists should be monks, not rock stars. Right.
Yeah.
And so, it's like distrust the people who are super flashy and got all
Yeah.
the stuff because, maybe they're overselling, maybe they're, cutting some corners, sort of like that natural selection of bad science paper that, which is so good, right?
Yes, that's a
People who are doing the really
great
flashy
paper.
stuff,
Yes.
there's can be selection for that, but great paper,
Yes.
by the way.
Yeah,
And,
Richard and Paul we need to have on. And I know Willem and Karthik have another related one. And Paul, I think, is on that too. We should have all those folks
yeah,
on. Yeah.
But you see, Kiki, this is why it's good to be boring sometimes.
Yeah, you should. This is another PSA. Like,
slips.
really value. We should. There's like, really, there is huge value to boredom, and I
Hmm.
really think this, like, um, the idea that you should be entertained is a really dangerous idea from like a epistemic stance to take towards the world. If you're like, I
Oh yeah.
insist that I need to be entertained by something, and I'm going to evaluate everything on according to the entertainment value it provides, like, buckle up. That's gonna make a really rough social experiment.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I have a blog post on that very topic
Oh,
called,
cool.
you will find this interesting.
Oh, cool.
Um,
I should. Sorry,
uh,
David.
yeah, no, basically arguing exactly what you just said, that our sense of what is interesting is in many ways not to be trusted, or it's not a reliable guide to what is true and useful. And it can often lead us toward bullshit in various ways. And I think there's an overemphasis on interestingness and being interesting in our culture.
So we have
Um,
just we have
yeah.
just explained why we're not interesting and boring, and why it's a
Yep.
virtue. Yes.
Hmm. Yeah. We've given a self-serving, cynical explanation for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't want to go on to something else if we still have more. I mean, I think there's so much to say about cooperation. And I mean, so here, I'm going to give you two options, Pat. One is there a high level sort of summary description of like the kinds of solutions to the problem of cooperation that you've discovered? And then option B is, and you can do both or one or the other, is Martin and Margot, and
Mhm.
talking a little bit about them and sort of how you found them or who they are, because we haven't really talked about them.
Okay, let me deal with the first one first. So one of the things that I try to do, when not being a snake oil salesman, is to try to, like, rather than coming up with a flashy title. A lot of people like to, I have this new theory, and they have their acronym for it or whatever. Um, Rather, somebody else may have a good idea, and I'll say, "Hey, that's great," and then really like dive into that. So some of the stuff I'm known for, competitive helping, is the idea that we are only implicitly competing in a biological market over social partners, right? So it's beneficial to be selected as a friend, an ally, a mate, a business partner, coalitional ally, etc. Right? And in that competition, you benefit from demonstrating your ability to provide benefits, but also your willingness to provide benefits. One way to do so is to not just to be nice, but to be nicer than the other guy, right? To not just be competent, but be more competent than the other person, right? So, we're very familiar with people competing to appear more competent, right? Athletics is all about that. Um, or intellectual competitions or whatnot. But there is also competition to appear nicer, right? Or I am more devoted to you than that other person would be. I'm a better friend than that other person would be. Therefore, you should spend more time with me. And one of the best ways to get a good partner is to be a good partner. And so, competing subtly over how generous one is in order to demonstrate both your ability to give, but also your willingness to give. And so this is kind of a combination of ideas from a number of other people. Gilbert Roberts first put out the idea of competitive altruism. And a couple of biologists, Ronald Noe and Peter Hammerstein, came up with the idea of biological markets and organisms competing over partnerships. So it's taking those ideas along with the idea of costly signaling, of how can you communicate information about yourself in a way that's honest and guaranteed to be honest, as opposed to just being cheap talk. Hey, look at me, I'm cooperative, trust me. Okay, well, why should I trust you? How do I know that it's honest? Well, I'm doing something that would not be worth it if I weren't actually intending to follow through, right? So it's kind of combining these different ideas together into this framework of biological markets and competing over partnerships. So it's drawing from these other areas and trying also to give credit to all of the researchers that have come before, right? This is not a replacement of reciprocity; it's an extension. It links reciprocity with mutualism. And so that's one of the ideas that I'd like to be known for, this idea of a biological market for partnerships and how that shapes how we communicate our attributes, whom we choose, how we choose partners. We choose them based on their competence, their ability to provide benefits, and their willingness to do so. That affects our skepticism towards them when we believe that somebody's honestly a good partner versus when they don't. So that's a big chunk of it there. More recently, I've started to get into this idea of stakeholder generosity, and again, there's many people have come up with this before. Again, I seem to be using Gilbert Roberts' terminology of stake, because I think it really nicely reflects the idea that one organism can have a vested interest in somebody else, and all of these other actions, like reciprocity, can create a stake in a partner. If we're engaging in purely economic exchange, I come to have an interest in your well-being, and I will help you because of that. If you just happen to be providing, public goods, cooperative benefits, I have an interest in helping you, and so that provides an additional selective pressure for me to help you and for you to produce these goods. So it kind of nicely links many of these other causes of cooperation, including reciprocity, including signaling behavior, but also links to many of these other things like byproduct mutualism.
Right. And I just want to say I love this market idea because it's really it's dynamic.
Mhm.
And I think one of the things, and it was really influential for me when I worked on a paper about leadership, and it was a similar idea of sort of like what any outcome looks like. I think people have this idea of sort of like, well, like things are static, and so why does cooperation look like this, or why does this kind of cooperative relationship look like this? And you see a range of sort of like both parties do really well versus like one party's sort of exploited and one isn't, but there's still cooperation. And I think without the idea of sort of this market idea, what you talked about before, if
what's your outside option?
Yeah, what's your other option? And I think that is a really powerful idea. It's a complicating idea. I think people don't like, the sort of snake oil people don't like complicating ideas, but I think it's really important for realism, which is that, and I think it's such a profound insight. And I think your work inspired me. And I think it's worth saying out loud that this idea of what a relationship looks like is not just a function of the sort of like kind of relationship it is. Like, is it a cooperative relationship? It just looks like this automatically. It's cooperation combined with the market forces of what are the other partners' options. And I think that's such a profound idea. It sounds simple when you say it, but I think it's such a profound idea. So thank you for interjecting that. I think it's super
You're welcome. But I mean, it's not just what are their options, but also what are their needs, right? I mean, because this is where supply and demand come in, and how these can vary from environment to environment. So in one environment where there might be not a lot of food, right? Food is in high demand. So somebody who's particularly effective at producing food becomes a very high value partner, because that's what you need in that location. And that's going to affect somebody's market value and what you value in a friend or a mate or in any relationship. In other environments, food might be plentiful, but maybe there is conflict with outgroups, or there's conflict over resources, in which case coalitional aid is very important,
Mm,
is in high demand and low supply. And so you might become a more valuable partner by demonstrating, your toughness and your loyalty to partners, and willing to to help them fight off exploiters. So what gets valued in a partner can vary from environment to environment, depending on the local supply and demand, what is needed in that location. And I think that's something where this perspective can also lead into cultural differences, right?
right.
In different physical environments, different traits can be more valuable. In different sociological environments, different traits can be more valuable, either because they are more needed or because they are in shorter supply. And that affects what people are going to do to signal their traits. It affects what people are going to want in a social partner, and how exactly they're going to compete over them.
That's really interesting. And maybe even individual differences. Like I think one of the
Yes.
tropes of life is sort of like people, I think all of us sort of sometimes we look at people and we're like, why is that person with that person, whether it's romantic or socially or social identities? Like, why would this political party support this political candidate? And I think the idea of sort of being humble about or thinking about that they might have needs or be
Yeah.
coming from a place that we don't have in
Mhm.
understanding or being open to hearing about or learning about what their needs are, whether they're real or perceived, it might go a long way to understanding why people are doing or choosing the partners they're choosing.
Yeah. Yeah. So some individuals will have different needs depending on their phase in life, right? Where they are, how old they are, what their profession is, their environment. So yeah, there's going to be individual differences both in needs, what they can pursue. It also means some individuals maybe higher market value and are able to pursue different strategies. Because somebody who's very competent might spend more of their time demonstrating their competence. Somebody who doesn't have that might instead need to focus more on demonstrating their loyalty, right? I might not be as awesome, but I value you way more, right? So there are all sorts of compensatory strategies that different individuals are going to follow as a result of their own position within the market.
Hmm.
So it's a very rich perspective in
Yeah.
order to be able to predict individual differences, cultural differences, ecological differences, in what people desire. And it's a very we would expect a lot of plasticity in terms of how people respond to these different social environments, that they have grown up in. And how the past environments are going to affect them today because it has affected the market they have grown up in.
Right.
Hmm. Well, I want to float an idea by you, Pat. It's an
Yeah.
idea that Dave and I discussed on the first episode. It's in a working paper that I'm continuing to think about, and that's between or that's it's about a conflict between what we might call competitive altruism or partner choice
Yes.
psychology and intergroup competition and
Yeah.
intergroup conflict.
Mhm.
And it may be that we have this rich partner choice psychology where we want to signal how kind and generous and fair we are, how humble we are, and we're evaluating other people based on whether they're going to really provide help for us, whether they're not going to stab us in the back. We're looking for peaceful, collaborative partners who divide resources fairly. And so there's all that stuff that we've gotten into
Mhm.
in a variety of ways throughout the past hour and a half or so. And then there's this psychology of intergroup conflict,
Mhm.
where in that case, you don't want to divide resources fairly. It's in your Darwinian interest to divide resources in a lopsided way that
Mhm.
benefit your group and exploit the outgroup. In that context, you want to actually dominate and coerce the
Mhm.
outgroup. You want to if aggress against them, attack them violently, and take their stuff whenever you can do so safely and at low risk. When you have a numerical advantage, it's in your interest to do that from a cold Darwinian perspective. And
Definitely
so,
need to bring in the cold Darwinian perspective so that people know that you're not personally advocating this, but
yes,
you're just
absolutely.
outlining the Darwinian logic.
Yes, outlining the Darwinian logic. But there's a fundamental conflict here, and that it's hard to say violently attack an outgroup when you have a numerical advantage just for the sake of dominating them or exploiting them or taking their stuff. It's hard to do that when you live in a partner choice psychology where people are constantly evaluating your moral character. and scrutinizing everything you do from that lens. So if I look like a mean bully when I behave in that way toward an outgroup, or if I'm a leader and I'm proposing a coalitional project where we go out and we attack the rival group just for no other reason than it just self-interest or dominance,
Yeah.
well, that's going to make me look like a really mean, ruthless, bad social partner.
Who
And
might
so the
turn
idea,
on their next social partner
yeah, who might
next.
turn on, yeah, exactly. And so the idea is that this might be one of the functions of what we might call ideologies or political narratives, that they function to reconcile this conflict between partner choice psychology on the one hand and the needs of intergroup competition on the other. That we need to create these pretexts that aggressing against the outgroup is morally justified. They're evil. They're going to attack us. We're doing it in retaliation. It's a preemptive strike, or maybe the gods said that we had to do this. There are the history books are littered with these kinds of pretexts. But the argument is that we actually need these pretexts to be able to mobilize effectively in intergroup competition, because if we can't have a pretext that is compatible with our partner choice psychology, then our collective action is doomed to failure. And so what do you think about this idea that one of the reasons why we need these moral pretexts is to reconcile the conflict between partner choice psychology and intergroup competition?
Yeah, it's a great idea. I've been thinking along similar lines where
Yeah.
some of this is signaling to one's in-group that you're not next, right?
Right.
So
Exactly.
it's signaling we are attacking them, and so I can't just turn around and suddenly do the same to you. So I think a lot of it is reassuring other coalition members that you will benefit from the spoils as opposed to become the next victim. I'm always surprised that people aren't a little more skeptical of that. I love the line, an appeaser is someone who feeds a crocodile in the hopes of being eaten last.
Yes.
So I'm very surprised that people don't kind of see through that more than they do. But I do think that a lot of it is along the same lines of exactly what you said, about trying to still maintain value towards your desired partners, people with whom you could cooperate, but assure them that they will benefit from this action, as opposed to I'm just a mean bastard who tends to take from anybody, and you're next.
Cool. So you buy it?
Yeah, I buy it.
Okay.
I'd like to see the mathematical model of it first, and
Oh, damn.
Pat
Barclay, you're
Barclay's
always doing this
stamp
to
of
me.
approval.
You did this to me with humor, and now you're doing it to me with this.
But I've heard you've got it. For some of the other questions, you've got some good stuff on there. So
He's got math now.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're
Yeah.
keeping each other honest. That's how this works.
Yeah, we are.
So,
It's true.
yeah.
It's great.
And then Martin and Margot.
Wonderful human beings, and great researchers. I trying to think where to start. I mean, if you want to talk about origin stories, I mean, somebody could easily give their 40-minute origin story on each of them. But Martin Daly and Margot Wilson are two of the founders of the field of evolutionary psychology. They both came from an animal behavior background, so those trained as animal behavior, and getting, I think, which gives people a really, really strong basis in the biology. So for anybody out there who's like interested in evolutionary psychology, I'd recommend brush up on some of the non-human literature. Is really useful, because it really helps strip away any preconceptions we have about what humans are like, and cultural differences and all this other stuff. Look at at the non-humans to really get at the underlying logic is useful. So they both came from that tradition, and then they started working on humans. Funny enough, they were reading group working on sociobiology, and they were reading about Sarah Hrdy's work about lions, killing male lions, killing cubs in order to cause the females to come into estrus earlier, or killing cubs that weren't their own.
Right.
And then somebody's like, what about the wicked step-parent myth? So they say, all right, well, let's look into this. And they start collecting, they realize nobody had looked at this. So they started comparing data using rates of like step-parental abuse to try and test this idea that, if parents love their own kids more than other people's kids, we should expect to see less abuse, less homicide in biological parent, at least in step-parent families. And they found that. They ran all these other things, controls for it, and they started using homicide data to test all sorts of other hypotheses in many other domains. So other questions about parenting. Okay, well, which children are people going to love more? Like, there's an awkward question. Which of your two kids do you love more? No parent wants to answer that, but they started asking those kinds of questions and using homicide data to test that, using it to test hypotheses about mating, and jealousy, to start testing hypotheses about risk taking. Looking at like male homicide and the effects of inequality on risk taking and homicide, and using very, very careful analyses and started pushing evolutionary psychology into other domains. So starting, criminologists started to become interested in their findings, saying, "Oh, this is cool, right? These are very convincing data." To psychologists using these data very, very carefully controlled in order to say, "Oh, okay, this makes sense." Also very cautious about their conclusions, which I think also helped, because it's very easy for people to make big flashy statements and sell their snake oil, which attracts some people but will push away other people. And certainly evolutionary psychology has attracted its share of controversy, but their good, careful research did help to bring a lot of people on board, including many biologists who were like, "Oh, yes, okay, this is cool. We're treating humans like another animal, albeit a very smart social and cultural one." And
one of those being Pat Barclay. One of those being you, yeah.
Sure, I guess, yeah. But they also they trained a number of other researchers who carried this on. They trained people within animal behavior, and they within human stuff. Like Lisa DeBryan, Nick Pound, Andrew Clark, Danny Krupp, a few other people that they trained in this the same sort of idea. Catherine Salmon. So a number of other researchers to kind of carry on this perspective, and coming up with some of the same ideas that some of the other schools of thought, like with the Leda Cosmides John Tooby group, also coming up with. So there's a lot of back and forth between those groups, a lot of sharing of ideas, also focusing on like what's the underlying psychology, and always looking at, well, what is the mind doing in this? So rather than looking at the behavior itself being selected for, instead the selection for a brain, and that brain is doing stuff. And so I think those perspectives fit very well together. Both of them served as president of the Human Behavior and Evolution Society at one point. From what I heard, Margot Wilson was the one who actually was really pushing for evolutionary psychology to be the name, as opposed to Darwinian psychology.
Yes, Leda and John would tell. So because I was a student of Leda and John's, and my understanding is that Martin and Margot and John and Leda, they went down to, because I think John and Leda were in Santa Barbara at this point. They went down to like Palm Springs because Martin and Margot had a desert kangaroo site somewhere.
Kangaroo rats.
Yeah, and they had this meeting about what we should call this thing, and there was exactly this discussion about, do we call it Darwinian psychology or evolutionary psychology? So Pat, you know more about? Do you know?
A little bit. I think Margot's logic was like, just in case in the future, maybe Darwin's. We decide that Darwin's version of evolution is maybe not exactly the way that it works. We don't want to be tied to one particular name, and I think maybe this is wise to not be focused on individuals, but to be focused on ideas. There's a great quote that the the strength of a field is measured by how quickly it forgets its founders.
Mm.
And it means that that field is moving on, right? And coming up with new ideas. Like Darwin's ideas aren't right because Darwin said them. They're right because there's a crap ton of evidence for it.
Yeah.
And so you could do great evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology without ever reading Darwin.
Right. That's interesting. When I hear people talk about Darwin and they talk about Darwinian, actually, it kind of always rubbed me the wrong way. And I think this might be part of it. Like like I kind of hear I'd rather people talk about like selection pressures, like the principles and not the source of the idea. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. We should be good based on, the ideas, not the people.
Right.
So
Yeah, I mean, it ties into your partner choice work. If you're competing to display your competence, you want to be known as the person who had the awesome idea, and we want to all participate in that competitive altruism dynamic. It suggests, a reason why we're so interested to, tie things to names rather than just the ideas themselves, because ultimately the idea was produced by a status-seeking primate who wants credit for it, and it's hard to step out of that to do good science.
Yeah, it will affect the incentives for science. So yeah, we do got to be cautious of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know what else you want me to say about Margot. Margot unfortunately died of cancer in 2009, which was I think a great loss to the field, not only for her science, but because her humanity. So she was always big on bringing different groups on board, right? People who might not normally have had a voice, and bringing them and making sure that they had a seat at the table. Reaching out to people in other countries, to help facilitate the developing evolutionary communities in those countries. They were some of the people who got the Human Behavior and Evolution Society going. So it was kind of a collection of people from McMaster University, which is where they were at the time, and University of Michigan, and I believe Northwestern, kind of all meeting up. And so those three universities was kind of forming the core of HBES. And it took off from there. But also I think their fostering of good science, and this is one of these stories about Margot Wilson that I love, is I was giving a job talk, and I had prepared this talk, and I was giving it to the lab, and I could kind of see that it was not going so well. And I have to preface this by saying Margot Wilson was one of the loveliest human beings ever, just very warm, very generous, just a person. And so at the end of the talk, and I can see, it wasn't going so great. And I finished the talk, and she just looks at me and she's just like, that was shit. And she's like, but we're going to work with you to make sure that you get it to where it needs to be. And so for the next week, every night they worked with me on it. And it only works because Margot was the sweetest human being ever. So when you're talking about intentions, you know that her intentions were really good, right? Because they, and it was not this self-seeking, I'm better than you kind of thing. No, it was this warmth being like, you are not meeting your full potential.
Right. Let
us help you to reach your full potential. And I love that. I love that attitude of, what, as a field, I think we would benefit from saying, we could do better. This is good. Let's take it and do better. And I mean, I wouldn't advocate, that sort of language in general, because you don't know the intention.
Right.
If I were to say to some random person that was shit, they'd be like, "Wow, Pat's a real asshole."
There's some people on Twitter that could use that advice, Pat. Actually.
Yeah. But I think the general attitude of, let's police ourselves to make sure that it is all good quality, that we don't have those, control conditions left unrun, to make sure that we plug the holes, to make sure that we deal with the alternative explanations, and that it's all communicated well. I love that attitude of combining very strong scientific rigor, but also with the warmth to be like, okay, let's bring up everybody. We'll bring up everybody and help everybody to do good stuff, but also making sure that we don't accept substandard stuff, to make sure that we have demandingness in our work in order so that it ends up being cited in another 50 years as good, solid stuff that survived the replication crisis, and that ends up having a lasting impact.
Yeah, kind and competence. So the kind, unkind, competent, incompetent is a 2 by 2 cell, and you can occupy the kind, competent cell of that.
That's, I think, a good
but
goal.
also
Good goal for everybody.
and a kind of altruistic criticism, because oftentimes criticism is interpreted as competitive and aggressive,
Yes, because often it
but
is.
because it often is,
Yes,
but often it is altruistic, and it is the intent is to help rather than to hurt. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think well-meaning, and this is maybe the private comments versus the public Twitter comments, right?
Mhm.
Those are just self-aggrandizing.
Yeah.
But the private, like, hey, this is good, but here's some ways you can make it better. I think is good, and I think that's a good model, to aim for. The monk model of doing good work
Hmm.
rather than the flashiness, and doing it well, and providing the private criticism to bring everybody's work up. So I'm sure you have criticisms of my own stuff, and please, I'd love to hear them so I can make it better. But we'll maybe do that off camera.
No,
Yeah,
no, Barclay, your stuff is spotless. I couldn't find a thing to criticize in there if my life depended on
keep shoveling there, Pinsof.
it.
Well, I mean, I think in that respect, I think, Pat, you have done a wonderful job sort of continuing we should have Martin on, but
Yes,
Margot's
you should.
legacy. We need to have Lita on as well. It'd be fun to have them on together. I do remember John, who also we lost more recently than
Yeah.
Margot. He talked about Margot, I think it was at HBS. It was sort of like a memorial. And he showed a picture of where she grew up. And I remember the one thing that stuck with me was he said, and you might know about this too, Pat, where he said she sort of had a difficult childhood. Like it was sort of a rough
Mhm.
physically, like, I mean, I think she like grew up in like kind of a physically challenging, like kind of in the
And
woods.
Canada's North.
Yeah. And John's take on that was sort of it opened her eyes to sort of that life can be difficult and it's important to sort of be sober about what exists and to sort of, I don't know how to put it, but he sort of argued that he thinks it sort of allowed her to sort of operate and look at things that other people might look away from, like homicide,
Mhm.
not because it was salacious or to sort of be statusy about it, but to sort of say this is really insightful because, as they argued, most homicides, people are motivated to figure out why it happened. It's a
Mhm.
really rich data source. It's really clearly showing the output of strong motivations, like
Mhm.
it's not an
There's strong
accident.
passions involved,
Exactly. So you're really
but
getting at a big part of human nature.
but
Yeah.
it's also a data set that, um, you know you don't have like self-reporting bias, right? People
Right.
self-presenting themselves in a
Mm,
particular way.
yes.
They initially got into that because with the child abuse data, people could always say, well, maybe there's a reporting bias.
Right.
Okay, well, let's look at homicide, because the vast majority of those get reported, right? So it's just a better data set, and they found even stronger effects,
Right.
right?
It's not like homicides are found out by self-report of just the people who admit to killing people, right? Right. It's that
Yeah,
when we discover a body, there's an independent, disinterested group that are trying to figure out what happened.
yeah. There was a paper a while back about calling psychology is the science of self-report and finger pressing, right? You're experiment, ding, 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 or self-report. What happened to behavior? And I think looking at things like
Yeah.
homicide data is a great example of there's real behavior involved here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, but yeah, thank you for being with us today. And yeah, really, I can't emphasize that if people haven't looked up Pat your work, they should look you up. And yeah, and just thank you for helping solve this problem of cooperation and doing it in a way that is not snake oily, and that very much is in keeping with Margot's spirit of sort of doing things carefully, and not in a flashy status seeky way.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on here. It's been great, and thank you for hosting this podcast and getting ideas out to everybody. You're doing a great job of exposing people to some great researchers. I've listened to some of the other people you've had on here, and they're fantastic. So I'm honored to be in that category.
Thank you, and we're
We're
gonna.
honored that you spent some time chatting with us, and we'd love to have you back sometime, of course. This was a wonderful conversation, and
Yeah, we have to have you back, and we love
yeah.
the idea of sort of getting return people, just talking about other stuff now. Once we get under under what you do, so to pick our brains as a group. Thank you so much, Pat. It was wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So you have spent another couple hours with David and myself. Congratulations, or I'm sorry, depending on how you feel about it.
hmm If you enjoyed the time you spent listening to us, please say so. Tell people about it. Um, you know, write us a kind review. Write about us on social media. Anything to help spread the word. We do this with the hope of actually reaching people, and the only way we can reach people is if you help us out by spreading the word.
That's right. We have such wonderful guests, and I mean, one of the reasons we're doing it too is because the wonderful guests we have on are not all unreached. So yeah, to whatever extent it feels like weird to um, uh, click on something to broaden the reach, just remember that there's all kinds of someone else will do it for someone else who isn't as deserving. Let's put it that way.
Yes, absolutely. So please do your part, and yeah, we'll see you next time with another awesome guest.
Sounds good, David. I'll see you in about a week.
Sounds good.
All right.